Hi, U.S. history students. So this week we finally get to the end of World War II. And like the end of the Civil War, there are some blessings that come out of this, but the very final stages, things get really awful. And so we're going to kind of live in that today in this lesson and next time, and then we're going to pivot from there into the Cold War. So let's just jump in and begin. For today's short lesson, I just want to focus on the final stage of the war in Europe. So I want to begin by introducing to you a major figure in 20th century American history, and that was Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman became president when FDR died. Harry Truman was new to the position of vice president for FDR's fourth term. And of course, FDR would only serve a couple months of his fourth term. And so Truman, gets his stuff set up at his office. He has a sum total of 2 meetings with FDR during those months when he is VP, and FDR, doesn't really bring him up to speed. I mean, FDR didn't really delegate. He just tended to charm people a little bit. And so Harry Truman is kind of clueless in a way when he becomes president. He is capable, as we'll see, but he had this quote. I mean, on the day that it happened, he said, I felt like the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on top of me. He's like, I'm not ready for this. And his resume was thin. He's from Missouri, and outside of Missouri, he was not really all that well known. He's pretty easy to underestimate. He's our last president to not go to college. He wasn't a smooth talker. He wasn't a charmer like FDR. In fact, he was kind of blunt. He had a very rated R vocabulary. And he was just sort of simple in a certain way, like he's plain spoken and simple. Now maybe that was sort of how he presented himself, because he recognized that his homespunness had some political appeal. But he's not a worldly person. He's not an especially well-read person. He's someone who's like, I understand a few core basic principles. Now, I want you, his advisors, I want you to tell me the situation, tell me everything I need to know, and then let me decide. And boom, we're going to do this, and then we're going to go. And Truman would have a very successful presidency. He's known especially for his decisiveness in finishing World War II, and then his decisiveness in confronting the Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of the war, and setting out the parameters for what would become the Cold War. But let's not get ahead of ourselves quite yet. First, we have to finish the war in Europe. Now, that process has been underway for a while. The Russians have been pushing from the east. Now the Americans and the British and the Canadians are pushing back from the west. Hitler commits suicide. Late April 1945, the Germans finally surrender. What's called VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, is celebrated. But let's take a look at the costs here in Europe. Right. This chart tries to take the incomprehensible numbers involved in World War II in terms of like the deaths, and it tries to make them somewhat more comprehensible by just turning them into graphics, right? Every symbol on here represents 100,000 dead. Now, I understand that on some level that's just our brains can't take that in, but if we can try for a moment. When you analyze this, you'll see things like Russia, the fighting in Russia. When we said the fighting in Russia was savage and bad, we weren't kidding, all right? We'll note things like Poland bore a particularly awful cost among its civilians. The Star of David icon is a death in the Holocaust. We'll note that relatively speaking, the United States didn't suffer as much as many other places did in this war. Nowhere we can really go with this other than to take it in and pause and consider the costs in this, the costs of confronting evil. What do we mean evil? In a way, the true depravity of evil that we were confronting wasn't fully clear until the war was over. And people and the outside world came to understand what had been happening in Nazi Germany. The Holocaust was uncovered as Russian and British and American troops are moving through Germany and Hungary and Poland, places that the Nazis had conquered or ruled. And they find in these remote locales concentration camps. And at first, there just isn't really, they're trying to figure out what are these places, right? Are these prisoners? Like, what did they do? Who are these people? Are these POWs or something? There just isn't really a paradigm that existed in people's heads for what they were looking at when they found these places. And of course, the people that they were finding were unwanted people. First and foremost, primarily the Jews, who, as we've read about, have been Hitler's bugaboo since he was a young man, right? And he had sort of like kept putting forth this idea of the Jews as parasites, the Jews as vermin, the Jews as germs. And we see like the full and awful manifestation of that rhetoric made reality here. But there were more than just Jews, right? There's 10 million who were killed in the Holocaust alone. 60% of those were Jews, but there's also Roma, or sometimes called gypsies, and homosexuals and political prisoners, right? Just people who disagree with the Nazis. What was being seen by the Allies here in these camps was sort of the final stage of something that had been building up for 10 plus years, all right? Like early on, the process of the Holocaust begins with harassment, right? Harassment of the Jews, like this night of broken glass, this Kristallnacht, like attacking their businesses or forcing them to wear symbols that like identify who they are, or forcing them to live in certain parts of the city. And then the efforts just sort of escalate as especially as the Nazis expand, because at first the idea of much of these policies was to just get the Jews out of Germany. But then the Nazis are expanding everywhere throughout Europe, and then they find themselves with these same Jewish populations, and so then they turn to what they called the final solution. Instead of like having these places as, you know, what are called concentration camps, where Jewish and unwanted groups are being held and concentrated away from the public and worked, and of course killed sometimes, it transitioned into becoming, these were like death camps or death factories. And one of the horrifying aspects, one of the things that makes the Holocaust so horrifying is that it takes all the technology and efficiencies and economics of like a modern industrial factory and applies it to this project or process of killing unwanted human beings. Right? How can we do this in the most cost-effective, efficient way? How can we keep careful record of how we're doing all this? They become death factories. And like a factory, the victims, like this young woman you're looking at, right? When the business is done, after they've been killed through this, normally the way that the bulk of the killings happen is through gas poisoning. Because that was seen to be the most kind of cost efficient. And I don't want to get into all the details here because it's just really so awful. But after that's done, the bodies are harvested for any gold fillings, or hair can be used to make wigs or pillows. Human fat can be used to make soap or lubricant. And so like all these things are harvested from the bodies, and then the remains of the bodies are cremated. And this is something the like of which has never been seen before in history, right? I mean, there have been atrocities and killings, but not to this scope and scale, and also rarely driven with such racial animus. Like the sort of the degree of racial hatred here is something that's really hard to get our heads around. Stories floated to the outside world. It's not like nobody ever heard anything about this. People knew that there were concentration camps where people were being held. All right, they knew that the Nazis were not nice and the Nazis were no good. I mean, there was like a general understanding of that, of course. And when stories would float out, the response in the outside world, or let's say like Churchill and FDR, when reports would occasionally hit their desk about like someone escaped and told us this story, I mean, in some part people are like, this is crazy. This cannot be true. This is so over the top, right? Guys, stop exaggerating. And sometimes it's like, well, what can we do, right? Whatever is happening behind the Nazi lines will get dealt with when we defeat the Nazis, right? We win the war, and we will solve whatever problem we have here. And then once they do recognize it, there is this thirst for justice or vengeance. I mean, you can decide what you think of Churchill's statement here. There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. And it has been done by scientific machinery, by nominally civilized men in the name of a great state of one of the leading races of Europe. Everyone connected with it should be hunted down and put to death. This picture hangs with me. I mean, there's some pictures that are gruesome and you can't unsee. This isn't gruesome in a traditional sense. But this is SS officers and secretarial staff at one of the most notorious of these death camps from Auschwitz, when they get sent off for kind of a weekend holiday. The Nazis even recognized that there is sort of a warping effect to being in these camps and working in these camps. So they would sort of send them away and say, hey, take your secretaries and your ladies and mistresses and go off and have a little German summer picnic and have some fun. And what you see here looks like something that would happen at, a school retreat or something like this. But it's also the banal face of evil, right? On Monday, they'll be back to work with what they had been up to. The world's response to this is swift. Some of the things that happened as a result were things like the formation of the nation of Israel becomes something where there is a worldwide sympathy for that to occur. And within a couple of years of the war's end, the nation of Israel will be established by the United Nations with the intention that it be a Jewish homeland. So these people that had not had a homeland since the time of the Roman Empire would have one and not be a sort of a persecuted or mistreated minority everywhere they lived. The Nuremberg trials was an international tribunal or an international court that was set up to try the people responsible for the Holocaust. And many dozens of people were imprisoned or executed after being put on trial in the Nuremberg trials. And I will just finish with a note of gratitude rather than darkness. When I study this, one of the things that I am grateful for is our core principle that is in the Declaration of Independence, that we build ourselves on a system that says all men are created equal, we are endowed with rights, that human beings can't be categorized as vermin or germs or parasites. And to the extent that people engage in rhetoric like this, it's deeply un-American. Anyway, I hate to leave you there, but the end of this war is some awful stuff. So we're going to stop here for today, and we'll pick up with the end of the war in the Pacific next time we meet. You guys have a great day. I'll see you soon.